Which 16-bit Sega games are better in Japan? For millions of gamers, the 16-bit Sega Genesis Mega Drive was Sega's greatest game console. Despite Sega being one of the greatest Japanese video game companies, Japan itself only accounted for 11% of global Mega Drive Genesis sales, while North America and Europe were a whopping 87.3% of console sales. I have been poring over all the Mega Drive and Mega CD games of Japan to find more games to tell you about. In this video, I'm going to go over 7 awesome Sega Mega Drive games and 3 Mega CD games where the Japanese versions were quite different and quite better than what we got in the West. But before that, you can support this channel for free by clicking the subscribe and like buttons to help YouTube get this video out to more people. Sonic the Hedgehog from 1991. Japan price $10. Sonic the Hedgehog was the most well-known and most well-regarded Genesis Mega Drive game. When I heard that there were regional differences in the original Sonic the Hedgehog game, I had to find a copy to include in my latest shipment of games from Japan. When Sonic the Hedgehog was first released in America in June of 1991, it was then later released in Japan a month later. Yuji Naka and Sonic Team used the extra development time to improve the game and add some more features and graphic effects for the Japanese release. The original North American release was Rev 00, and the Japanese release was Rev 01. The later revisions have been included in compilations and later pressings, but the early North American and European releases did not feature these changes. In Green Hill Zone, the clouds are moving in the revised edition with a really sweet 16-bit effect. In Marble Zone, the clouds have parallax scrolling with even more awesome 16-bit programming wizardry. For Labyrinth Zone, they added a water ripple effect similar to what we would see in Sonic 2 and Sonic 3. Now, I want to point out that in all editions of Sonic 1, the waterfall in Green Hill Zone looks slightly transparent because of a graphic trick that Sonic Team had used where a slight blurring happens when the game is displayed on a CRT TV using composite, AV, or RF. The game developers took advantage of a kind of blending of images that CRTs use, and you don't see this effect on component cables, emulation, or FPGA. There are times that I like a nice crisp pixel graphic, and there are times that you have to realize that these games were intended to be displayed on a CRT TV with all of its inherent imperfections. Regardless of which version of Sonic the Hedgehog you are playing, it's going to look great. Bare Knuckle 2, also known as Streets of Rage 2. Japan price $15. Streets of Rage 2 expanded on the side-scrolling beat-em-up action of the original, but with bigger characters and some of the best 2D sprite work ever created. For this game, groundbreaking music and techno composer Yuzo Kishiro took a bigger role in the development of this game, was passed to a new development house called Enchanted, founded by him, his sister, and partially run by their mother. Enchanted delivered Bare Knuckle 2, known as Streets of Rage 2, and the rest of the world, and there were some unique differences between the original and Western versions. Blaze's flying kick, jump forward and press B, has a different sprite depending on which version you are playing. In the Japanese version, you can sort of see up her skirt slightly. In the American version, her sprite was changed to stop a potential 4 pixels of panties from being shown, and her arms were also placed differently. Surprisingly, the European version does not feature this change. If you pause the game and press A in the Japanese version, a counter will appear above your character's life bar, which shows you how many enemies you have defeated. This is only in the Japanese version of the game. Also, Adam's younger brother is called Sammy in the Japanese version and is called Skate in the American version. Towards the end of the game, the big bad guy, Mr. X, can be seen smoking a cigar in the Japanese version. He doesn't do this in the American version. He's still a crime lord that terrorizes the city, but he does it without smoking. That's important. Ancient went on to create some absolutely amazing masterpieces of 2D gameplay and sprite work, but their inaugural game, Streets of Rage 2, goes down in history as one of the best 16-bit games of all time. Vampire Killer, aka Castlevania Bloodlines. Japan price $300. For the 1980s and 90s, the Castlevania games that were produced by Konami were headed up by mostly different teams, and they didn't feature a persistent staff until Koji Igarashi helmed the series after Symphony of the Night. But that didn't stop the team working on the Mega Drive version from putting out an absolutely amazing game known for its creativity and excellence. When this game was brought to the US as Castlevania Bloodlines, it was after the point that Sega switched from hard plastic cases to flimsy cardboard boxes. The American version came in a flimsy cardboard box. The Japanese version came in a real plastic case that looks great on your shelf next to other Mega Drive and Sega Genesis games. The German video game rating board, known as the Unterhaltungssoftware-Selbstkontrolle, was established in 1994, and they were rather vocal in their displeasure with the presence of blood and violence. So the European version had Bloodlines in the title changed to New Generation, and the American and Japanese logo of the game, which was dripping in blood, was replaced. There were also many changes to the European version to make it less bloody. This is ironic considering German folktales and Christmas traditions are way more hardcore and bloody. This is coming from the country that has Krampus, the demonic wild man who is traditionally Santa Claus's best friend and is known for kidnapping, beating, and throwing naughty children into the lake. This is from the country that celebrates Krampusnacht to get the kids in a festive Christmas spirit. By the way, I just want to go on record that I love Krampusnacht and bloody violence in my Castlevania games. This game featured two heroes, John Morris in the Western version, who was known as Johnny Morris in the Japanese version with a whip, and Eric Lecard, who had a blue cape and fought with a spear. The Japanese version of Eric Lecard was clearly designed as a Bishonen hero. Bishonen is a Japanese term that means beautiful guy, and anime and manga in the 90s featured plenty slender, tall male protagonists with pretty faces and long flowing hair. These characters were actually popular with female fans. His character design from the intro was changed to be less glam and David Bowie in the Western versions. Nowadays, we are much more down with various gender expressions, and if K-pop and manga has taught me anything, is that the ladies actually do like a pretty guy. The Japanese version only presents you with a password after you get a game over, and the Western versions show you a password after finishing each stage. Now, the Japanese version has a region lockout. This was removed from the international versions, which are region-free. Western fans have been driving up the price of the Japanese version of Vampire Killer, which is going for about $300 these days. But if you happen to find one, you are going to need a Japanese Mega Drive or a clone system which does not care about region lockout to play it. You can actually play the Japanese Mega Drive version of Vampire Killer in the Castlevania Anthology Collection on PlayStation 4 and other consoles. Ristar, Japan price $500. Ristar is an awesome side-scrolling platform game made and published by Sega. It was well regarded, but strangely Sega never followed up with a sequel. It is a great 16-bit Sega platform game which is often overlooked by a certain famous blue hedgehog. The Sega Mega Drive was not doing so hot in Japan when this game was released in 1995. The Sega Saturn was already on the market in Japan, so copies of this game go for about $500. This game was hit by the angry cute video game mascot trend of the 1990s. Kirby was made to have a scowl in the West and was designed to look cuter in Japan. This affliction also hit Crash Bandicoot and Ristar. Ristar's default animation is more cheerful in Japan, and most enemies had a neutral or cheery expression in the Japanese version, which was changed to have their eyes altered to make them scowl. Some other sprites were changed to get rid of references to Japanese puns. This game was also made slightly more difficult by reducing the amount of continues on the normal setting from 9 to 5 continues. Mega CD games better in Japan. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 Mega CD games. A cool thing is that the American Sega CD can play Japanese Mega CD games without issue. A European Mega CD drive might have issues running NTSC games on a PAL system. Sonic the Hedgehog CD, also known as Sonic CD. Japan price, $50. Sonic CD was a major undertaking in convincing gamers to purchase the very, very expensive Sega CD. The system retailed for $299 in 1992, and if you would adjust for inflation, that would be over $630 in today's prices. That's right, the Sega CD unit was more than the PlayStation 5. I actually saved up as much as I could to actually get one back in the day because I was hoping that Sega would follow up with expansive 2D awesome games like Sonic CD. Unfortunately, we got just barely changed Sega Genesis games or not quite fun full-motion video games such as Sewer Shark and Night Trap. Sonic CD is the Sega CD's killer app. For some explicable reason, Sega of America thought that the original Japanese soundtrack sounded too much like European dance music, and so they completely redid it. Spencer Nissen did a decent job with the North American version with more of a synth rock feel, but I greatly prefer the original dance music inspired soundtrack. I'm glad to see that both soundtracks are preserved and represented in later re-releases of the game. But if you haven't heard the original European techno-inspired Japanese soundtrack to Sonic the Hedgehog CD, as it was known in Japan, you really should check it out. By the way, European gamers got the Japanese version of it with all these sick Eurobeats because they could handle it. Final Fight CD, Japan price, $40. As I said in my last video about the Sega Master System, I have a sweet spot in my heart for third-party games that Sega licensed and did their own conversions when they brought it to their own game platforms. The Sega CD, known as the Mega CD outside North America, featured additional memory, additional processors, and was generally a lot more powerful than a basic CD drive for the Sega Mega Drive. Sega took advantage of this and produced an absolutely phenomenal near-arcade accurate version of Final Fight that actually had two-player simultaneous gameplay. They really wanted to show up Nintendo, who only had one-player Final Fight on their system. Final Fight featured a good amount of regional changes to tone down the sexiness, and the American Sega CD version featured a lot of these changes. The Japanese Mega CD version did not. Jessica was seen wearing a bra in the introduction animation, which was changed to a strapless dress for the international version. The bad guy Damned did not have his name changed to Thrasher and actually laughed in the Japanese intro. Pioneer video game trans women bad girls Poison and Roxy did not get changed into generic dudes with overalls in this version of the game, but their midriffs and booty shorts were adjusted to something a little less scintillating. At the end of the game, Belger, the crime boss, actually rode around in a wheelchair instead of an office chair of the international version. The bar sign actually said bar instead of club. Sodom's name was not changed to Katana, and the bad guy in the bonus stage says, "Oh my god," instead of "Oh my car." And the Japanese version, when you hit a bad guy with a sword or knife, they squirt blood. Another interesting thing to note is that the American and Japanese version of Final Fight CD gave you 5 credits to play through the game, but the European version only had 3. Personally, I think that if you bought a home conversion of an arcade game, you should be allowed to put as many damn virtual credits in as you want. I'm glad to see that both versions of Final Fight CD are on the Sega Genesis Mini 2. Keio Flying Squadron, Japan price $40 to $100. US price $700 to $1,000, disc only. The US version can be as high as $2,000 to $3,000 boxed. Definitely the most esoteric and less known game on this list, Keio Flying Squadron is a cute-em-up where you play as a girl in a bright leotard who flies around on the back of a dragon and shoots armies of flying Japanese tanuki raccoons, and also the American expeditionary troops accompany Admiral Perry in the black ships. It is an over-the-top, insane game with heavy Japanese themes, and it's sort of crazy that this game actually went and did get a US Sega CD release. However, it's pretty rare and can cost you as much as a used car these days. The original Japanese version is actually a little bit more of a challenge because if your dragon hits the ground, you will take a hit of damage. This was changed in the international version, so if you want more of a challenge, get the Japanese version. Both versions of the game are quite tough. The heroine's age was increased for the international version, but it's actually pretty surprising to see a very, very Japanese-themed game be brought to the US at this time with surprisingly little changes. Magical Hat Turbo no Buttobi Tabo Daibōken, aka Decap Attack. Japan price $18. Decap Attack was actually based on the anime Magical Hat Turbo no Buttobi Tabo Daibōken by Studio Pierrot. The graphics were completely changed from a colorful kids game anime to a dark monster-filled romp. The kid with a giant magical hat was turned into a headless mummy who would shoot his face out of his chest. In the original anime game, one hit from the bad guys would kill you, and in Decap Attack, you can take other hits. I thought that the graphics would be better as a colorful anime, but the difficulty in the original game is brutal. Normally, some games are actually made way harder when they are brought to America, but this was one of the few cases where it was actually made easier. I like how the main character has the Star of David on his chest. Often in anime and manga, the Star of David is used as a generic mystic symbol and denotes magical powers. I know it is not accurate Jewish representation in anime, but it's more wacky than ignorant. Street Fighter II Dash, also known as Street Fighter II Champion Edition. Japan price $20. I have already covered the PC Engine version of Street Fighter II being unappreciated in the West, so it's about time that I did the same for the Street Fighter II Dash for the Sega Mega Drive. The Super Nintendo and Super Famicom versions did not have the intro attract animation of the two fighters before the logo, but it is in the Mega Drive version. The attract mode sequence features a dude of African descent being knocked out in the Japanese version and the arcade. The American version changed it to a light-skinned dude, but also changed his hairstyle. The African dude was actually going to be a playable character at some point and was named Max, while the Street Fighter who punched him out was named Scott. Both of them showed up in the story mode of Street Fighter V and was a pretty cool deep cut. Another big change is that 3 of the names of the boss characters were shuffled around. Originally, The boxer was known as M. Bison, as in Mike Bison, and it was changed to avoid the courtroom wrath of Mr. Mike Tyson's legal team. The Spanish fighter with a claw was known as Balrog, and the dictator was known as Vega. In the international Street Fighter competitive scene, the three characters are known as Boxer, Claw, and Dictator to avoid confusion. All of this could have been easily avoided if Capcom came up with a different name for the boxer that they totally modeled after Mike Tyson, but didn't want to legally acknowledge it. Another thing that they left unchanged in all versions of Street Fighter II in the 90s is the rising sun on the wind animation in E Honda's stage that featured the yellow and red stripes of the Imperial Rising Sun that is synonymous with the World War II era Japanese Imperial Army. Future references to this flag were removed in all later releases of Street Fighter, both in new and old games from 2001 and onward. It is interesting to point out that the Japanese version was also released in the rest of Asia, which historically had a lot more issues with the Japanese imperial flag, and for good historical reasons. It is interesting to point out that the Japanese version was also released in the rest of Asia, which historically had a lot more issues with the Japanese imperial flag, and for good historical reason. It is especially interesting that this game was released in South Korea on the Samsung Super Game Boy and later on the Samsung Super Aladdin Boy, and the Imperial flag reference was left intact. One of these days I need to do a video on Samsung releasing both Sega and Nintendo consoles in South Korea. Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. Japan price, $10. Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle was the only 16-bit Mega Drive outing for a one-time major Sega mascot, and it was a very early Mega Drive game. The game features facing off with an enemy character by playing rock, paper, scissors, also known as Janken Poi in Japan, or simply Janken. In the international versions of the game, the losing character will be hit with a giant falling anvil similar to Looney Tunes shenanigans. However, in the original Japanese version, their clothes will fly off and their groin will be obscured with a leaf before they turn red with embarrassment, both for losing and being naked. Apparently, this was too much for Western sensibilities and it was changed to a cartoon anvil. Japanese anime and manga humor at the time often featured real cartoon nudity and not just implied comedic nudes here. Where to get these games and how to play them. As I said earlier, you can play Japanese Mega CD games in the US Sega CD without modification because they are both NTSC systems. Most Japanese Mega Drive games will not fit in an unmodified Sega Genesis, but you can get around this by shaving the plastic around the cartridge port with a rasp or by using a Game Genie. Almost all clone systems that use FPGA emulation or systems on a chip have no issues with running Japanese cartridges. One easy way to play the Japanese versions of these games is to get a Sega Genesis mini console and Genesis Mini 2 and set the language of the system to Japanese, and the Japanese versions of these games will display. They also use different save states than the Western versions on the same console. It is interesting that the Japanese versions of Alex Kidd and Ristar are on the Western versions of the Genesis 2 and the Genesis Mini 2, since these games are not on the Japanese Sega Mega Drive Mini 1 and 2 systems. The US Genesis Mini has the Japanese versions of Castlevania Bloodlines, Streets of Rage 2, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Street Fighter II Championship Edition. The US Sega Genesis Mini 2 has these Japanese versions of Ristar, Sonic CD, and Final Fight CD. The Japanese Mega Drive version of Vampire Killer is in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection. The Sega Genesis Classic Collection on the PS4, Switch, and Xbox has the Japanese version of Street Fighter II and Ristar, but not the other games. Sega of Japan sold 3.6 million Mega Drive systems domestically, while Sega of America sold over 20 million systems and Sega of Europe chalked up an impressive over 8 million systems. Sega of Japan got quite salty and passive-aggressive at times that Sega of America and Sega of Europe sold almost 8 times the Mega Drive Genesis consoles than they did in Japan. Because of this, it can be quite tricky to track down physical copies of Japanese Mega Drive games, but it can be worth it. It would really help me grow this channel if you would consider subscribing and tell your friends and enemies about this channel who are into retro video games. This has been 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome, play retro.